Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 526 through 528, which will cover manga chapter 606 through 609. And the crew finally make it to Fishman Island, but their arrival is not without a lot of commotion and trouble. So the synopsis: the Sunny and the crew keep having to face even more obstacles, whether it be undersea volcanoes, the legendary cursed ship the Flying Dutchman, more fishermen pirates. But through it all, they finally make it to Fishman Island, only to be separated once they make it to the island, but are helped by a familiar face. Alright, so differences. There are only a few differences that I found in these. So the first one is at the end of episode 527, just before we're introduced to the silhouette of the main villain in the arc. The manga has a couple panels where a couple of mermaids find the barrel where Caribou is locked up. Whereas in the anime, we don't see this happen. Of course, we'll see this later on, because it does play a big role in the story. The next one is at the beginning of episode 528, we get the scene of Nami, Frankie, Robin, all safely making it to the shore. However, this scene is not in the manga, and what's stranger is that in the manga and the actual canon material, when we do catch back up with Nami in the future, she's not with Frankie or Robin, so this scene was a really strange addition. But I guess they wanted to show how they made it back. And then similarly, we also get to see a brief scene of Zoro once he's on land, as well as he's surrounded by the royal guards. This was also not in the manga. But yeah, as far as changes, that's pretty much it. So with that, let's get into the episode. So picking up from last episode with the sudden appearance of the Flying Dutchman, of course, calling back to the introduction of Brook. Interestingly enough, Brook knows all about the supposed ship's captain, who in this universe is a man called Captain Vanderdecken, and the giant man-child creature thing is actually a massive fishman called Wadatsumi, which is a reference to the Japanese water deity, basically the same name, but in those legends it's said that the Watatsumi is a dragon-like god. Interestingly, Wadatsumi kind of bears a slight resemblance in massive size and looks to one of Blackbeard's new recruits in San Juan Wolf, which kind of leads me to think that they may be from the same species of fish people. Now, in this scene kind of shortly following this, I have to mention this because of how absurd it is, but the anime has this moment where Nami realizes that it's getting really hot due to the sea volcanoes heating up the water around them, and you see her tugging at her bikini top like she's trying to air it out like you would like a t-shirt or something. But the thing is like, she's in a bikini top. You can't really get that much more aired out than that. So what is she doing here? Like, what's that even gonna do? There's not enough fabric to wave to generate any kind of extra airflow. It's so weird. I feel like they just inserted this scene just so they could have a shot of Nami in her bikini tugging on it and seeing her like boobs bounce. It's dumb. Anyways, getting back to the actual content. With the Sunny under threat of attack from Wadatsumi and no way to escape, they're in a huge pinch. But to no one's surprise, Luffy has managed to tame the Kraken, and it comes in the nick of time to save them. Again, showing off another one of Luffy's more underrated abilities, and that's his skills in taming animals and understanding them at sort of a very base fundamental level. We've seen this going back all the way to Orangetown with Shushu and how he just immediately sort of understood Shushu, despite the fact that Shushu was just talking by barking with ruff, ruff. And most recently with his training with the animals on Ruskaina Island, we see that he's made friends with those animals as well. And aside from Luffy being just a very simple-minded and primal type of person, in this particular arc, we start to get hints that this may in fact not just be something random or sort of a special bond that he has, but it's an actual skill that Luffy has, or a special ability that he has to speak with the animals. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to that point in the arc. The Kraken, now named Tsurume by Luffy, proceeds to wail on Wadatsumi until Luffy tells him to stop. And it turns out they're all okay, but it's crazy how casual the three of them are, considering just how close the monster trio came to dying. With both Luffy and Sanji's bubbles broken, they had to all evacuate into Zoro's bubble, and the three of them are just kind of like scrunched into one bubble. Now, Tsurume is Japanese for dried shredded squid, which is very on brand for Luffy to name his new pet Kraken after food, especially squid food. And speaking of food, in an SBS volume, in I think it's volume 66, Oda once stated that if you made takoyaki from surume, it would make meals for 1,250,000 people, which is a lot of takoyaki. And I have to say, once Surume is on their side, he's actually pretty cute with how he smirks and gets a little bashful at Luffy's compliments. It's a pretty... I like Surume. Now, before we move on, one thing you may notice is how familiar Vanderdecken's voice is. We don't really get to see him, but we get to hear him. And that is because he is played by Wataru Takagi, who is the voice actor for Bellamy, as well as 100 other voices throughout anime, like... for those of you who are Naruto fans, Adult Obito from Naruto Shippuden. He also plays Knuckle from Hunter x Hunter from the Chimera Ant arc. But most memorable one for me outside of Bellamy are his two roles in Detective Conan, or Case Closed as it's known in the US, where he plays Genta Kojima, one of Conan's detective boy's friends. But his best role is probably police detective Wataru Takagi. And that's right, he plays a character with the same name as himself. And so when I think of Wataru Takagi, I instinctively think of Detective Takagi from Detective Conan, which is also another one of my favorite series and another very long-running series that seems like it's never going to end, similar to One Piece. And in fact, Aoyama Gosho, who writes Detective Conan, is friends with Oda. And in fact, recently they did an interview where they interviewed each other about each other's work. If you have a chance, go find that interview. It's pretty interesting. They even talk about the potential like ending to each other's stories, and they're both very vague but also very informative at the same time about each other's series. But also, Detective Conan is an incredibly underrated series in anywhere outside of Japan. And so, yeah, if you like mystery, or even if you're not a mystery fan, I highly recommend it. It is one of the greatest series that I've ever read, and it's one of the very first manga series I ever read as a kid, which is very weird because there is a lot of like murdering and like pretty gruesome deaths. But I promise you, it's a lot more wholesome and more kid friendly than you would think. Anyway, with that whole Detective Conan tangent aside, let's get back to the main story in One Piece. So eventually, the undersea volcanoes do erupt, causing abrupt chaos everywhere, causing them to have to outrun the debris. But due to its sudden speed, they can't get away from it until Usopp gets his chance to shine with his new pop green technique, the Sargasso, which is a reference to the Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic Ocean that's kind of wedged in between North and South America, where this move sprouts huge vines of seaweed to help slow the debris down, almost like a net. And everyone is either amazed or impressed by Usopp's new ability. But the one I always liked is Zoro, sort of like his subdued hey. Like, one thing I always loved about the crew is that both Zoro and Sanji, the two strongest members of the crew, are always subtly looking out and rooting for Usopp, because they both know he's a capable person when push comes to shove, as long as he believes in himself. In fact, Usopp, like I've always said, he kind of seems useless, but he's not. And a lot of it stems from the fact that he just doesn't have any confidence in himself, even though the rest of the crew believes in him almost completely. And in particular with Zoro and Sanji, like you saw this particularly with Syrup Village, with Zoro willing to encourage and help Usopp, and even going so far as to become Usopp's support in taking out Django. And then, of course, we have Sanji during the whole Water 7 and NES lobby arc. But even then, Zoro is also supporting Usopp the whole time, even trusting him with his life by having him become his sword when they're cuffed together and fighting Kaku. Even at the end, when Zoro was the one who was the most adamant about not welcoming back Usopp unless he apologized, Zoro was one of the Nakama that Oda chose to highlight that Zoro was actually concerned and worried that Usopp hadn't shown up when they were on the brink of having to leave him behind on Water 7, and was also seen visibly happy when he did finally apologize and grabbed Luffy's arm. Like, Zoro and Usopp's relationship is always an underrated and understated one, but one that is actually fairly strong when you really stop and look closely at it, and I love it. And I think it all stems from their very first meeting, with how Zoro saw a pretty courageous person who yeah, he was weak, but was willing to put his life on the line to protect his village. And the fact that, yeah, again, he was willing to do it by himself. Like at that point, he hadn't known that the other three, Nami, Zoro, and Luffy, would have helped them. But seeing that both Luffy and Zoro recognize that Usopp is someone worth helping, and then that's when they decide to step in. And I think from there on, Zoro really saw who Usopp was, and so he always has been rooting for Usopp. And thanks to Usopp, they do escape the debris for the most part until they count their chickens a little too quickly as a huge boulder falls and smacks Tsurume in the back of the head, plunging them all the way down. But when they awaken, they're greeted to the beautiful sight of Fishman Island finally. And we're here, like the place that had been talked about since all the way back in the East Blue Saga when we met Arlong and his crew. Fishman Island, along with Elbaf and Wano, are islands that are often mentioned, but we don't get to see for a long time. But we get to cross the first one off the list with Fishman Island, finally. And you even see a very familiar Sea King here, and it's that big cow whale-looking Sea King that appears in the Calm Bell, and also in the We Are opening. This is the same Sea King that the Mary accidentally found itself on top of when they went into the Calm Bell inadvertently just after they left Logtown and before they reached Reverse Mountain. However, before actually getting to the island itself, they're intercepted by a huge herd of land mammal-looking sea monsters being ridden by several fishermen who have both the Sun Pirate and Arlong Pirate tattoos. They are named Hammond, Hyozo, and Kasagon, and they're apparently affiliated with the new Fisherman Pirates, perhaps an offshoot of Arlong's crew. And Nami, being the captain when they are sailing, takes control of the situation, knowing that they don't stand a chance against these fishermen underwater. They know full well Luffy is never going to submit to them, so Nami makes the executive decision to blast their way towards Fishman Island with the last remaining air they have with a Kuda burst, and they go flying through the water into Fishman Island. A couple interesting notes about this scene is that we get the second name drop of the famous Fisher Tiger, the one that saved Hancock and the Boa sisters, as well as other slaves from Marie Joie, and is considered the hero of Fishman Island. It was at this point I remember getting interested in the fact that we could learn more about Fisher Tiger here, and even see the moment of the slave freeing from his perspective, potentially. Additionally, if you look carefully, and in the anime it's a bit harder to see, but in the manga it's clear as day, the new Fishman Pirates have the same Sun Pirate tattoo, but it's a little strange as there's a beheaded silhouette inside it, whereas if you look at like Arlong or Jinbei, their sun tattoos are filled in with a large dot, clearly indicating that this is a potentially more extreme or perverse version of the original meaning of the tattoo, which we will go on to learn more about in this arc as well. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention about this moment is how Brook mentions how it's hard for him to breathe, even though he doesn't have lungs. And I remember when I saw this moment, I thought to myself, does he actually need to breathe? Like, I know he's useless in the water because of his devil fruit, but does he actually need to breathe? But I think he can survive without breathing, as he seems to be able to sustain himself without food or water, like he did for 50 years on the ship in the Florian Triangle. Like, it's surprising that Oda has never actually addressed this in an SBS yet, but I fully believe without lungs or needing oxygen for his blood, he could probably go into space and just breathe fine, or he could probably fall into the water. Sure, he'd just be a dead weight, but I think he wouldn't die of drowning because he doesn't need oxygen, I feel like. Oh, and another thing. So with Hammond, he has a very unique laugh, and I think this is one of my favorite ones. So his laugh is hama 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 hama, because obviously Hammond. And it's probably, like I said, a low-key favorite of mine, as it sounds ridiculous, more so than many of the others. Also, the name Hammond comes from the fact that Hammond is a dagger-toothed pike conger, and in Japanese it's called a hamo fish, and so that's where that Hammond comes from. Hyozo is a blue-ringed octopus, and in Japanese those are called a hyomando, which is where his name comes from. Also, if you notice that he's kind of the inverse of Hachi, whereas Hachi, since he spent more time on land, seemingly he had 2 human-like legs and 6 octopus arms. Unlike Hyozo, who lives most of the time underwater, has 2 regular arms and uses 6 octopus legs. And since, obviously he spends more time underwater. And the final one we see is Kasagoba, which his name comes from the Japanese name for and I'm probably going to butcher this, but a Scorpeniformis, and Kasago basically is a line of fish that are, what lionfish come from. Oda's pretty on the nose with his namings, as we all know. Now, in their haste to get away from those 3, they make it through the outer bubble, but discover that within there's another layer of seawater, which they stand no chance in with 4 devil fruit users. But luckily, they're saved by a familiar face in Kami. But the crew gets split up again, and we don't know what happened to the others just quite yet. And a joke that I got a chuckle out of was when Kami introduced her friends, the Medaka mermaids, who introduced themselves one by one, and there's a clear pattern where in Japanese they follow the numbering of ichi, ni, san, yon, or 1, 2, 3, 4. So it goes ichika, nika, sanka, yonka, but instead of going to go, as in 5, for the 5th sister, she introduces herself with a funny curveball by telling us her name is Yonka 2, with Usopp even interjecting, why can't it just be Goka here? Now, the Medaka sisters are based on guppies, and they have a unique way of speaking, kind of in the same order that their names are based off. So Ichika starts off by making a statement, then Nika reinforces that with an exclamatory version of that statement, then Sanka states the opposite of the original statement, and then Yonka then questions the statement, finally ending with Yonka 2, who questions whether the original statement even mattered or was needed. And they do this several times, it pretty much every time they appear on screen. It's a pretty funny gag, but it does kind of get old.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Welcome to DMR, Dewey's Movie Reviews, an Australian-based podcast reviewing all the latest and greatest movies out there, all of the newest series on streaming platforms, an interview here and there, and of course all the celebrity goss as well. So if you're looking for a high-quality movie and series review podcast, look no further than DMR, Dewey's Movie Reviews, the red carpet treatment.
Once they start making their way out, Kami then goes on to explain how this part of town is where they have the mermaid cafes, and that she currently works at one, which Sanji gets grossly excited over the prospect of visiting one of these said cafes. And the mermaid cafes are most certainly a kind of reference to Japan's own culture of maid cafes. Now, these cafes that usually are decorated in very cutesy decor with very cute looking food and drinks, but the main draw is that you get served by very cute and attractive young girls dressed in maid outfits and sell you on the fantasy of being waited on by a pretty maid girl, which is a trope/fantasy you see a lot in fiction all over the world, but particularly in anime and manga you see it quite often. Now, I visited a maid cafe about 10 years ago with my cousin just for the novelty of trying it out, and I didn't really like it. It's kind of uncomfortable and cringy since you know that everything that these girls are doing and saying is all an act, plus the fact that this whole practice is like steeped in massive amounts of like misogyny. It doesn't help, although the girls are never treated poorly from what I can tell, and they seem to make a great amount of money. But to me personally, it's like a more innocent version of like a strip club, if that makes any sense. Also, the worst part was the food and the drinks are massively overpriced and average at best, and like most of the time pretty not great, which is surprising because like food in Japan is usually amazing. But yeah, the maid cafes, I mean, you know, the food and the drinks are not their main draw. But anyways, if you do enjoy maid cafes, I'm not here to poo-poo on your experiences. I mean, maybe you had a better experience than I did, or I went to a particularly bad one or something. But as the group set out for these cafes and to look for the rest of the crew, we get some world-building exposition from Kami, And right off the bat, you immediately get the lay of the society of Fishman Island as not being that dissimilar to our own real world, where there is social economic segregation as well as wealth inequality, and even potentially something similar to the practice of redlining of housing based on the people's backgrounds that which redlining is a practice from like the 1930s in the U.S. There were a series of federal policies that kind of assessed the risk of certain neighborhoods and would deny or make it very difficult for people in those neighborhoods to gain access to loans and financial services for housing. And these neighborhoods were often predominantly residents of minorities. And so it created this sort of imbalance where it devalued property and perpetuated this sort of cycle of poverty in very specific neighborhoods and made them kind of less desirable to live in. And we hear an example of this from Kami as she mentions how Hachi, because he's a fishman, lives in a rougher neighborhood of the fishman districts. And we also find out that this is not just between different populations and different kinds of fish people, but we see that even within one population, there is a great deal of inequality. Like within the mermaid dorms themselves, there's a divide with the richer mermaids being able to live near the top where the sun shines, just like with kind of the apartments in our real world where the top penthouse units are the most expensive and desirable ones, whereas the ones on the ground floor are very much not as desirable. Now, one thing to notice about that statement, though, is the big question is, why and how is there sunlight 10,000 meters deep in the sea? And that is an answer to a question that we won't get in these episodes, but we will get them later. So I'm going to save that discussion for another episode. It is a very interesting one, though, I will say. It's one of the more greater mysteries of One Piece. But not to be sidetracked, inversely, we see Pup-Pug, who is a rich fashion designer that lives in a place called Gilberly Hills, or Fishberly Hills in English, obviously mirroring our own affluent neighborhood of Beverly Hills in California. And speaking of Pup-Pug being a fashion designer, this is something that I mentioned back in the Hachan Seafloor Stroll cover story, where we see its first canonical appearance on the shirt of Kami, which she is wearing in the very first entry. And it has appeared in various different characters and places throughout the series as sort of an Easter egg, and it serves as a fictional in-universe clothing brand alongside the Doskoi Panda brand. And fun fact, its actual first appearance was on the cover of the 2001 33rd issue of Shonen Jump, where you can see Luffy wearing an inner tube with the branding on it. And I can't remember if I mentioned this in the cover story episode, but the name criminal comes from an old term used by the police to refer to criminals, particularly in J-dramas, as stars, which is fittingly what Pup-Pug, who is a starfish, named his own clothing brand. Obviously, the irony with this whole situation with segregation is how fish people and mermaids as a whole are segregated and discriminated against in the upper world by humans, and they're often dismayed at this reality, yet they practice these same behaviors even within their own society. As you can already see, the whole theme surrounding the Fishman Island arc is going to be one addressing the racism, prejudice, slavery, and segregation that surrounds fishmen and their place in the One Piece world among humans. Once they get to the top side of the Mermaid Cove area, one of them comments that they didn't come in through the main entrance, again kind of paralleling their journey to Skypiea, where they also weren't aware that there was a safer main entrance instead of going through the more dangerous alternative path, which for Skypiea was the knock-up stream. And so twice now they've kind of used the more dangerous entryway into those respective islands, which is I also found really fun and cool. And of course, Sanji's absurd reaction to the mermaids is just as annoying as ever, but I did get a kick out of Luffy's kind of offhanded mentioning of Sanji crying even more than when he left the Baratier. I did find that joke pretty funny, as well as the fact when Sanji exclaiming that he's found the all blue. Those are pretty funny, I'm not gonna lie, but Sanji gets worse. But yeah, we'll talk about that towards the end of this episode. But it's at the end of episode 527, we get our first glimpse at the arc's main villain in classic Oda fashion, shrouded in shadows, before we get our full look at him later on. And we don't even actually learn his name in this episode. We will learn it in 528 as being Hody Jones. But we'll talk more about Hody when he's properly introduced. And it's from here we start to move into one of the stupidest plot points in all of One Piece. But throughout this, we do get an interesting fact from Chopper as we learn that Sanji has a very rare blood type, which is something to keep in mind in terms of foreshadowing for Sanji. But if you're curious what everyone's blood type is, Oda actually does tell you what their in-universe blood type is, as well as their out-of-universe blood type in an SBS section. But for now, I'll just kind of list off the blood types for the Straw Hats. And yeah, obviously you can tell that the World of One Piece has very different blood typing compared to us here in the real world. But yeah, the other thing to keep in mind too with blood types, so in Japan, blood type is kind of significant. It's almost like used as like personality types, where they actually associate different personality types with blood typing. And in some rare instances, they'll like actually use blood type to kind of even for like job applications too, which is very odd. But yeah, so Luffy is F type, Zoro is XF type, Nami is X type, Usopp is S, Sanji is the SRH minus, which is the very rare type, Chopper is X type as well, Robin is S type, Frankie is XF, and Brook is X type. Also, just as a fun fact, Jinbei is F type as well. Now, one scene that I liked that came after this moment was, I particularly love the moment where Luffy expresses to Kami his desire to meet Jinbei. And his pure excitement and warmth towards the prospect of reuniting with Jinbei is just so heartwarming. Like, the way that Mayumi Tanaka performs this, as well as just his sort of childlike and very like warm reunion with Jinbei, I just really like this dynamic between Luffy and Jinbei. But sadly, we're informed that due to Jinbei giving up his Shibukai status and being a pirate, he can't actually stay in the Ryugu Kingdom anymore, which I remember at this point I found very strange, because despite being a pirate, Jinbei seems like a stand-up guy, and you'd think the citizens of Fishman Island would kind of be okay with that. But then again, pirates in Fishman Island have been shown to be particularly vile, with both Arlong and the new Fishman pirates being prime examples of that. And so I guess by association, Jinbei could be seen as an unsavory type of person, especially since what we know so far is that Jinbei used to basically be closely associated with Arlong some time ago, before the events of Nami's flashback. And speaking of the citizens of Fishman Island and the law, it's not long before the princes of Fishman Island come looking for the Straw Hats. So there's a lot to point out with the princes. All three of them have the naming scheme of the animal they're based off of, plus the word boshi at the end of them, which is just the word hoshi when it's used as a suffix, which means star in Japanese. So for example, the eldest prince, Fukaboshi, Fuka is another word for shark, so his name literally means shark star. Similarly, his younger brother and second son, Ryuboshi, is a Ryugu no Tsukai, which is an oarfish in Japanese. And then the third son, Mamboshi, is a akamambo, or a moonfish, hence his rounder appearance compared to the other two. And one thing that I always had a misconception of was how mer people in One Piece worked, and it stood out to me about these three, is that it made me question how in the world do genetics work with fishmen and mer people, as they're technically both. Like, I always thought that most normal mer people like Kami are basically top half human, bottom half fish. But with the princes, it made me very confused at how they were both like a top half merman and bottom half merman, top half fishman, bottom half merman. But I had it completely wrong. And this was just really confusing for me until I actually like sat down and really looked into it. So every mer person, even those that are pretty much top half human like Kami, all actually have an actual sea creature they're based off of. So for example, Kami is based on the kissing Gorami, which kind of reminds me of Inglourious Basterds when Brad Pitt's character is like Gorlami. But anyways, hence her very like pronounced lips in her design. And the sad thing is when I went back to her introduction in chapter 490, it clearly says this in her character title card, and I just failed to notice this completely for decades now. I'm serious. I just found out about this now, like when I was doing research for this episode, and it blew me away because like I don't know how I went this long without ever actually like looking into it. But anyways, it still doesn't really explain how the genetics of mer people and fish people work in One Piece, because when you look at the prince's parents, you immediately think to yourself, how does any of this make any sense? Like, because King Neptune and the Queen, who I won't mention her name here since we haven't been introduced to her name yet, are neither sharks or fish or moonfish. So it just doesn't. Also, physically, you'll see why these two just, you wonder what in the world is making this possible for them to reproduce, but that's another story. You'll completely understand when you actually see both their parents. Anyways, I think I've spent enough time on the fact that I'm an unobservant idiot, but moving on to the part that is so stupid, as the Straw Hats need to hide from the princes, as they're afraid that they might be found out and captured by the royal family. Sanji gets hidden by a very busty mermaid, and because she pushes his face into her chest, he eventually gets too excited and launches a mermaid-shaped fountain of blood into the sky. And, like, I get it. There are more absurd and stupid things in One Piece, but this was just straight up so dumb. You think, like an example of just absurdity that is unbelievable is related to blood, too, is how much blood loss Zoro sustains in most of his serious encounters. Like, ridiculous amounts of blood, more blood than a human body can contain. But this level of absurdity is just stupid. And so this results in Sanji needing an emergency blood transfusion. But with Sanji having that extremely rare blood type, as well as the fish people unwilling to or unable to donate blood due to the laws about not allowing the mixing of blood with humans, they are left in a bind. But Kami comes up with a plan to go to the harbor where there are other humans to potentially donate blood, and they basically just hijack the prince's ship and gets the hell out of there. But before we finish this set of episodes off, there are a couple bits of information that is conveyed to us that, as we learn just how deep the segregation and resentment runs between fish people and humans, and we learn it all stems from yet again the man that they call Fisher Tiger. As we learn how he ended up dying, it was due to him needing a blood transfusion at one point, but it was humans who refused, causing him to die a needless death, seeding that hatred towards humans even more. And we will learn more about this incident in his sort of flashback, but it's not necessarily remarkable how complex Oda has made the relations and history between fishmen and humans. Like, the more you learn about it, the deeper it runs, and you slowly come to the sad realization of, can this level of racism and resentment ever be fixed? Like, despite Sanji being the dumbest freaking thing about this arc and dragging it down so badly with this subplot, it is one thing that does save this arc is how interesting and nuanced, as well as the fact that despite its more simplistic depiction of these ideas and issues, they are a very real reflection of our own society today. And so I think the overall themes and sort of messaging of segregation and racism, as well as kind of this idea of forgiveness too, it is really central to the Fishman Island arc, and that it is saved. I mean, the whole Sanji nosebleed thing, it pretty much ends after this bit, but I mean, it's just so irritating. I can't tell you how annoying this is. And I'm not even like a huge Sanji stan or anything like that. Obviously, you know that I like Zoro and Luffy over Sanji. I love Sanji. He's my third favorite character. But so I don't necessarily care about him looking dumb or weak or anything like that, or foolish. Like, I actually like Sanji having some of these flaws, but when it's like to this extent, it's just ridiculous and it's annoying. But I am looking forward to talking about more of the better parts of Fishman Island and looking into the backstory of Fisher Tiger. Lastly, we learned that the princes are actually on the side of the Straw Hats and wanted to find and help them. And the kicker is that they even had a message from Jinbei that they were unable to relay because of the confusion and the sudden escape. This wasn't all that much of a surprise because, I mean, we kind of know that based on Vivi that the royalty of most of these islands are usually on the side of the Straw Hats because they are usually trying to liberate them from some sort of an evil force. But yeah, that's where we'll end it here. If you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. It usually helps me out. And check out my Instagram and Twitter account at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes. And yeah, I appreciate you all supporting me, and it's been really fun so far. So yeah, as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. A small spoiler section, but if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye. Okay, so spoiler section. Just two really small things. They're both involving the Medaka sisters, interestingly enough. So, two things come to mind. First off is how similar they are to the Vinsmoke children, including Sanji. I always kind of jokingly thought in my head, what if there was an Ichiji and a Niji, even way before Whole Cake Island? And so yeah, when these sisters were introduced, I really started to think that Oda may actually introduce some long-lost brothers of Sanji and call them Ichiji and Niji. And much of the community had a similar theory for the longest time too, ever since his introduction in some cases, just because he's introduced completely separate from his home and family, unlike many of the other Straw Hats. Of course, years later, we would learn that this was in fact the case with not only Ichiji Niji, but he also has a younger brother, Yonji, and an older sister, Reiju, for 0 and 4. And another thing interesting is, it's funny now knowing Luffy wasn't the first Nika mentioned in the series, but it's a funny coincidence that Luffy, who has the Nika fruit, and Nika of the Medaka sisters, is also wearing a red shirt like Luffy. And maybe this was foreshadowing of Nika and Joy Boy. I seriously doubt it. And this was probably a major coincidence. But I do find it quite funny that there was another Nika wearing a red shirt like that. But yeah, those are really the only two fun little things I wanted to kind of point out in terms of spoilers for the rest of the series. But if you did enjoy this, thanks for listening. And I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.